Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming to Count Your Shots, 45 Years of Space Invaders. We'll just do some quick introductions here before we get rolling.
I'm Kevin Bunch. I'm behind the YouTube series, website, and soon-to-be book, Atari Archive.
And I'm Brian Clark. I run 1millionpower.com, kind of a Shmupulations-esque site for those of you who know that, but way weirder. Lots of Japanese game dev stuff, lots of Japanese rock music stuff, so check that out if that sounds interesting to you. All right.
And today we're here to talk about something very interesting to both of us, and that's Space Invaders. So to start us off here, we have to talk about Tomohiro Nishikado, who was the lead designer for Space Invaders. He got his start at a Taito subsidiary, Pacific Industry, about 1968. He was not a game designer at that time, but he came into it shortly after the decade changed over. His first couple of games included Skyfighter and Skyfighter 2, which are, I think it's the next slide. Yes, these are electromechanical games. They are not video games, but he was really proud of them. And from there, he moved on to early video games that use transistor logic, or TTL. No microprocessors, no program code. And these include titles like Soccer, which was a Pong clone, Speed Race, which was a driving game, Western Gun, which you can see here. And later on, around 76, he did a remake of Skyfighter in TTL called Interceptor. Yep. And we'll start.
We have some videos interspersed here.
Yes. So, eventually he drew inspiration for doing a microprocessor-based game that would become Space Invaders from a few Western-developed games, one of which is Breakout here. I've talked about Breakout in other venues and its relation to Space Invaders, but the short version is that this is a game that was developed at Atari. I'm really bad at it. I'm sorry. Basically, it's sort of like a one-player version of Pong. Nolan Bushnell wanted a Pong that could be played single player. No one at Atari particularly wanted to do this because by this point it was around 1975 and the Pong fad had long since died. There was a rival company called Ramtech that made a ball and paddle style game like this called Clean Sweep, where you were getting rid of dots on the screen, and that served as sort of an inspiration as well as racquetball. And that's sort of was redeveloped into this idea. It was originally implemented by Steve Wozniak, Steve Jobs. Their version was not reproducible, and eventually it was redone by other Atari engineers, but that's really outside the scope of this. The important thing about Breakout here is that it was a big success in the US, but it was also extremely successful in Japan, where it was distributed by Namco. Namco couldn't actually keep up with orders based on the units Atari was shipping to them, so they actually had to break their contract and start, publishing their own units, just to keep clones and rival companies from taking over the market. Nishikado had seen Breakout, and it left a big impression on him, because he had seen Clean Sweep, and he was not impressed with it. He thought it looked really old and crappy. Breakout, he had this realization that you don't have to have a game with super advanced graphics or like realistic gameplay for it to be really appealing and really interesting. I believe this also popularized a tabletop format, which will become quite relevant later. And that's basically a table with a game built into it. You can put it in cafes and restaurants and that sort of thing. It made video games more socially acceptable in a lot of different areas that weren't just, coin-op arcades, particularly among women. This was a pretty good form factor for that. The other big thing that was an influence here was Gunfight, which you can see on the right. So this was a licensed version of Western Gun that took nothing from Western Gun other than the basic concept.
There were sure guns in both of them.
There were sure guns and cowboys. There's some cacti. It's good times. So Bally Midway out of the US, they got the rights to distribute Western Gun. They wanted to redo it because they felt that the little cutesy graphics that Nishikado had in his version were not going to appeal to Americans. So they turned to Dave Nutting Associates, which was a development studio that, Bally Midway worked with a lot on their video game projects. Dave Nutting and his employee, Tom McHugh, had a new Intel 8080 based microprocessor system that another one of their staffers, Jeff Fredrickson, had been developing. And Nutting really wanted to use this for their little gunfight game. So he did the design, McHugh implemented it in code, and this is what the result was. It was pretty successful. Nishikado did not like gunfight. He thought it was a much crappier game. But he recognized that microprocessors allowed a lot more flexibility in the types of games you could do and just the time and money that went into design. So he felt he needed to get to work on developing his own microprocessor-based development system. So he also saw Seawolf, which I didn't grab a slide of, but that's another early microprocessor-based game where you're a submarine shooting at boats. And yeah, around early 1977, he started work on what would eventually become Space Invaders.
Yeah, and they didn't have the equipment to make, or the know-how even to make a microprocessor-based game. So Nishikado, being an engineer, pretty much just put all the hardware together himself, because it was too expensive for them to import any kind of a dev system. He got a bunch of LSI, which are just large-scale integration chips with, thousands of transistors on them. And he basically just soldered them to boards himself, and basically programming them directly with assembly and a chart of hex code, more or less.
Mm-hmm. And so for Breakout, he took the vertical screen format and he took the idea of clearing a screen of objects, essentially. He made other little tweaks to the idea as well. So Breakout has 2 waves, and then the game is over. Your ball just has nothing else to bounce off of until you let it go past you. His idea there was to change this so you would have an endless number of waves. So you clear the screen, another wave appears, clear that, and such and such. So in theory, you can play Space Invaders, as long as your legs hold out. Or your bladder, what have you. He also replaced the paddle with a gun, the little tank cannon at the bottom. And because, you'd had, a wall that you could just shoot at, he had to change that, so now it was like a moving target.
Right.
And because that could still be boring, it fires back at you. Basically to keep the game interesting. Yeah, and he thought the idea with all of these changes and having endless waves is that it would keep the game interesting and keep people coming back to play it. Turns out he was correct.
And originally the theme was military, right? So his previous games, Interceptor and the Skyfighter, were themed around military. So they discovered that tanks didn't really work too well visually with what they were going for, and airplanes and ships just kind of didn't seem right with the jerkier sort of motion that the technology that they were using was able to support. There was also the idea of soldiers shooting, or soldiers being shot at, I should say, but that, especially at the time, was frowned upon by a lot of Taito executives. And particularly the president, Michael Kogan, had sort of a rule that, no, you can't have people being shot in our games. That's no good. And of course, given the time that it was, it's not too surprising that the space theme came in part from seeing Star Wars posters in 1978 when the movie was coming out in Japan. And so that kind of led Nishikado to use aliens for the antagonists. And the designs of the aliens or the invaders themselves are sort of War of the Worlds inspired. He'd seen the movie adaptation when he was a child, according to him and his biography, and then he just sort of mixed that with elements of sea creatures, which would, I don't know if it was because of this or not, but would also creep its way into some of Taito's future titles long after this. And so the Invaders are kind of based off of a combination of like crabs, squids, and octopi, depending on which one of the three types you looked at. And of course, it's 55 aliens spread out across 5 rows and 11 columns.
Yep.
As you can kind of see there.
Yep, and if you haven't seen Space Invaders in action, the Invaders, they sort of like chug along.
Yeah.
And
you'll see some clips later, too.
yeah, and as you clear them out, they start moving a little quicker. This was not programmed into the game, but it was part of the design from the get-go. Basically, Nishikado, he designed the hardware specs for the game. And he recognized that moving a bunch of objects on screen at once, they move really slowly, but as that cleared out, they'd start moving faster. So he just let the hardware take care of that problem for him. Oh, I have to get closer to the mic. Sorry. So yeah, he just let the hardware take care of that for him. He just didn't have to program any of that. He saved some memory, and then as a sort of an extra little added target, occasionally a UFO will fly across the screen. It's not in this shot, but
you'll see him later.
You'll see it later. And the UFO gives you a random point bonus. Well, he didn't have the memory to make that truly random either, so he just decided to set it based on how many shots you fired.
And we'll get into that
your shot
more
count.
later too.
So not too long after the game's release, people picked up on this, and you started seeing strategies on how to take advantage of that particular program aspect.
And we will definitely get into those. And kind of along those same lines, to make the game a little more difficult, we talked about waves. And as you progress, the Invaders start out one line lower to the ground each time to kind of, get you to either panic or get good, basically. And Nishikado programmed this for 8 waves, at which point the difficulty pretty much resets back to the first wave. So the original Space Invaders games have no ending. They just continually loop like many arcade games of the time. And no one in testing could get past wave 5.
Yeah, he didn't think it was important to make it.
Yeah.
He didn't think, wave 8, that's fine. No one can get any further.
Who was going to be able to play for that long anyway? And overall, Space Invaders was developed in about 10 months, with 6 of those just getting and building up all the hardware, since it was all from scratch. And Nishikado broke in the middle of development to do design work for Super Speed Race and TT Soccer, and some miscellaneous other things as he found working with code and the microprocessor setup was just particularly grueling for him. So kind of going back to his comfort zone there a little bit.
Yeah, both of those are TTL games.
Yeah.
It's something he was pretty much an old hand at it by that point. So Space Invaders, if you want to click back to that one, yeah. So it was originally known by KX79. That was his code name for the title. Eventually, that changed to Space Monster. And according to Nishikado, this is because there was a then popular song from the band Pink Lady, or the pop duo, whatever, called Monster. And he thought that, this song's really popular. Maybe, if I name my game Space Monster, that'll help it stick in people's minds better.
And he wouldn't have known it at the time, but that song ended up being a million seller.
Yeah. Timeline-wise, it's a fun anecdote. I don't know how accurate it is or if it's just him misremembering, because the single for Monster came out in June 25th, 1978, about the same time that Space Invaders made its initial debut. It's possible that it was being played in clubs and on the radio before that, but I don't have access to a bunch of Japanese music industry trades, so I can't tell you for sure. But at any rate, Space Monster was not the final name for the game because, as it turned out, Taito already had an electromechanical game by that name, and it was not terribly successful. So he was requested to have it changed. Nishikado remembered that Kazunari Tajima, who worked in Taito's export division, was the person who came up with the name Space Invader, and then they got shifted to Space Invaders because it sounded better in English, which annoyed Nishikado because then he had to program in an extra letter on the game's title on the screen. Apparently that was a particular pain. There was also another space-based electromechanical game that Taito had just put out called Space Docking, so there was some concerns in the company about going back to that well, because Space Docking in particular did not do very well. But by that point, it was too late for Nishikado to change the theme, so they were just going to run with it.
And here, as we see a couple of the different variations of the cabinet design was done by Kazuo Nakagawa, who envisioned the battle taking place on the moon as like the last stand against the Space Invaders. And that's why, and I think particularly the one you see on the right here, a lot of them tend to have, in fact, the one you see here in the MAGFest arcade, you can see it kind of has a background which is, a moonscape, basically. So it's all kind of, according to that, I guess it's a mirrored backdrop. Because if you actually look into the screen, you can kind of see just the game sort of down here on the monitor playing without the lunar backdrop. So they're just kind of using mirrors to make that work. And the monsters on the cabinet art were actually a remnant from the Space Monster title. And the cabinets actually included a tilt sensor similar to what you'll see on pinball machines. So if somebody got a little, drunk and or crazy playing Space Invaders and tried to rough up the machine a little bit, it would kind of shut down on them. And another interesting little thing, and I think we kind of have this back right here. Nishikado had enough leftover bytes to play around with on the attract mode to where you can kind of see on the left screen here where it has play, the word play, you can see there the Y is upside down. So the Y and the C in this eventually forms the word play Space Invaders insert coin, and those letters kind of eventually flip themselves around as you let that run. Yeah,
the little invaders will come out and they'll shoot
turn
the extra
them around.
C or they'll flip the Y around. It's really cute.
Yeah.
So the original version of this game came out, it was a black and white cabinet that was shown to distributors in June 1978 alongside another game, Blue Shark. We'll get into that a little bit in a second. They had a color version of Space Invaders that they debuted at the October 1978 AM show. And that seems to have gone on sale sometime between then and December. It's a little hard to pick that out.
And before we leave this part and get to the initial reaction, so semi recently, a couple years ago, the Space Invaders Invincible collection came out, and in it was a book, which of course had a Nishikado interview. And one of the things that stuck with me of all the things I've read in his interviews was an anecdote he had about kind of the height of its popularity. His mom ran a dagashia, which is like in Japan is a small sort of like cheap candy store that will usually have a few cabinets. If anybody's watched Game Center CX, you've probably seen a lot of these in the tamage segments, like little hole-in-the-wall places with maybe 3 or 4 cabinets and a bunch of candy. And it was in Kishiwada City in Osaka, and she asked if he could get her one, working for Taito and all. And so Nishikawa went to the executive director of sales directly to see if Taito would sell him one to give to her. Cabinets were like extremely hard to get at that time, but probably because he was who he was, they made an exception and sold one to him. And because they were so hard to get, apparently people who would come to the store in the area would complain, like, how in the world did some tiny little hole in the wall manage to get a Space Invaders cabinet when no one else can?
Yeah, and speaking of the reaction to Space Invaders, here we've got Blue Shark, which you could say is sort of its competitor game. From Taito. This was in development internally at Taito. And when they showed off these games to their operators and distributors on June 16th, 78, Blue Shark was the game that everyone was more interested in than Space Invaders because, well, for a few different reasons. Space Invaders is not a timed game. Blue Shark is. So every, 90 seconds or so, Blue Shark ends and someone can put another coin in. You can't say that for Space Invaders. A game for that could be over in like 15 seconds. It could be over in minutes. It could go for a while, depending on how good players are. So there were concerns about this. Operators were concerned it wouldn't make a lot of money. And if players lose before they figure out what they're supposed to do, maybe they won't come back to it. Nishikado did agree with them on this point, but it turned out not to be anything they had to worry too much about. So in July, Taito started selling this game. They sold about 500 units initially, mostly to their own locations and a few of their long-standing distributors. Basically people who felt bad for the company that they were putting out this game that was clearly going to be a lemon, but they wanted to keep a good relationship with Taito. So we'll take a couple. But once it started hitting like cafes and bathhouses and restaurants, that's when it really took off. And that's sort of where you see on the right, you see these tabletop format games. Those were like extremely successful for them. This is sort of like Nishikado had an anecdote too that reminded me of the Pong story, like the original Pong prototype, where they realized that they had a hit on their hands when they heard that the machine was broken, and they went and they checked, and the coin box was overflowing. Well, that happened here as well. Apparently, they had a report that the machine had broken down a little under a month after it had gone out. This would have been like late July, early August. So Taito sent a technician out there, and he found that the reason it stopped working was because the coin box was overflowing. And that's when they realized that, this game's actually going to be a hit. We should probably start manufacturing more units. And by September, it was a massive runaway success, and they could no longer keep up with demand.
So what sets Space Invaders apart from other contemporary games, and kind of where did it innovate and popularize? Well, we kind of talked about the wave format earlier. Most earlier games were either timed, fighting against the clock, or it was some sort of a multiplayer experience, right? Designed to kind of end after a few minutes and, have fun. But Space Invaders builds on the two waves idea of breakout, of course, into an endless number, and like we were talking about earlier, kind of the only limit is the player's skill. If you learn the game and you get good enough, you can play for an extremely long period of time on one coin. High scores. The original version of the game did keep track of high scores, though you weren't until, I believe, part 2 able to actually enter initials. But even tracking high scores for the day was a bit rare at the time, which kind of promoted the culture of practicing to do score chases and whatnot. Character art, of course. The invaders themselves are pretty cartoony, cute little guys. For a 1978 arcade game, a pretty fair amount of detail, I would say. And then their personality kind of got built up a little bit the following year for Space Invaders Part 2. And they just sort of would go on to become culturally significant and culturally iconic, specifically in Japan. Taito still uses the Invader design for its mascot on all the Taito Station arcades and whatnot. You see them on the banners.
I have a Mega Rage bag here that's got Space Invaders on it.
Yep. And as you'll probably get sick of hearing once we get into the port and scoring clips, it has a very distinct audio soundscape. Like, it has a bass line that speeds up as the invaders get closer and closer to the bottom, which was created by Michiyuki Kame, a recent university grad student, with the intention to, not surprising, kind of hearkening back to the Jaws theme song, which would have been so fresh in everyone's mind around then. And then you can kind of see here with this image on the left, it does have a really interesting secret. If one of those skull invaders is the last one remaining on the screen, it leaves this trail as it does its final kind of speedy run across the screen. Most likely a bug, but it definitely looks neat.
Yeah, if you look through some of the old strategy books that talked about Space Invaders, this always comes up. Like, people thought this was neat.
Yep.
And it's hard to get those guys as one of the last invaders on screen. So it's like a little mark of your skill.
Yeah.
So we should talk about the invader boom in Japan first. So like we mentioned, Taito could not keep up with demand on their own. They sold reportedly 100,000 units in Japan by the end of 1978. For reference, Breakout, huge success, huge hit for Atari. That sold at best 15,000 units in the U.S. And Japan's a much smaller country. This is a saturation of arcade games that was sort of unheard of. So naturally, because Taito couldn't keep up with demand, other companies decided to take it upon themselves to, generously make unlicensed clones to fill the gap. So you had some of these. Sega made one, Space Attack. IPM, which would eventually become IREM, had IPM Invaders. Universal had Cosmic Monsters. Osaka World Vendings had World Invaders. This was published in October 1978, no less. This was like right on the bubble. Eventually, Taito had filed a lawsuit against these people for infringing on their copyright. And at this point in time, it was unclear in Japanese copyright law if that covered game programs, software programs. By the time that lawsuit was settled in December 1982 and a verdict was handed down, it declared that, yes, video games code and programs are copyrightable. So that sort of took a real hammer to unlicensed clones in Japan. It didn't destroy them, but it certainly helped these companies. And eventually Taito decided to license Space Invaders development to other companies, or production, I should say. So notable companies include SNK, Sammy Industry, Logitech, not the same one that made peripherals, and the future IREM, and another company called Jatra. So by mid-1979, this was sort of the height of all of this madness. There was an estimated to be about 230,000 Space Invaders machines out of 280,000 video game cabinets in Japan overall. About 200,000 of those were from Taito and its licensees. These were mostly located in cafes, pachinko parlors, retail shops, like Nishikado's mother's little candy store. Basically wherever you could cram a machine and expect to make some money. This sort of led to this idea of the Invader House, which was just a location covered in Space Invaders machines. That's all you could play. You would be hearing that marching sound in your nightmares. And this eventually led to the 100 yen shortage. This was sort of an interesting story because it used to be told as this was fact, and then it was for a long time considered myth. But it turns out it's kind of true. It just depends what time scale you're looking at. So there was a couple of months in 1979, around March and April, where the Bank of Japan did increase circulation of 100 yen coins because these arcade operators were not emptying out their machines as quickly as they needed to. So actually, the Japanese legislature reached out to Taito, and Taito started, bugging all of its, distributors and operators, like, hey, get these coins to the banks and out of your machines a lot quicker than you are. We don't want any trouble here. So that sort of helped resolve that issue. But it did happen. Just, if you look at it on a full year, it's not really noticeable. And the boom ended not too long after that, in June 1979, not because suddenly Space Invaders became passé, but because invader houses were getting this reputation of being like these 24-hour dens of seedy places and shady deals going on, and there was a moral panic. People were worried that their kids were going to go out there and pick up on some bad habits or fall into some bad crowds. There was concerns in the amusement industry that, oh crap, if we don't do something about this, the government regulators will. So the All Japan Amusement Parks Association, which was the big industry trade organization there, issued a directive limiting Space Invaders games to locations in areas with an attendant. So you couldn't just like set them up somewhere and go home basically. You also needed to have a parental accompaniment for anyone playing those under the age of 15, and anyone under 18 could not go into these game centers, by themselves. So this really hammered everybody who was making money off of Space Invaders. So like companies that were making these clones or making Space Invaders themselves had to branch out. Basically, you saw some like Invader hardware-based games like SNK's Osmo Wars, Taito's Lupin the Third, Space Invaders Part 2. Lunar Rescue, Polaris. Taito had a lot of Space Invaders boards, so they had a lot of games that they needed to use the hardware with. But it hit everybody pretty good. JATRA went under. Like they did not survive this. Other companies like IREM had to sell out some of its hardware manufacturing subsidiaries because that was the only way they could have hung on. And ironically, Taito opened an arcade in Kabukicho in August 1979, and one of their games was Space Invaders Jumbo, which is this unit on the left here. It's got a giant projector screen. They were running Space Invaders Part 2 on there, which we'll touch on a little bit later. It was not super successful because it was 200 yen to pop, and this was post-boom, so it didn't. I don't think any of these survive. I've never seen one outside of this photo,
No.
but it's an interesting little artifact there.
And not the same as Space Invaders Frenzy that you find at Round Ones and Dave and Buster's and those sorts of places now. And then, of course, this resulted in Invader Mania and a whole lot of merchandising. So Taito authorized, stickers, pencils, notebooks, shirts, snacks, you name it. Something somewhere probably had an Invader on it. It resulted in a song, Disco Space Invaders by Funny Stuff. And it served, of course, probably more importantly as an inspiration for Japanese group YMO, Yellow Magic Orchestra, in their kind of exploration of video game soundtracks that resulted in their song called Computer Game. And they would even go on to form the first publishing imprint for video game soundtracks that there ever was in Japan. And you can kind of see in the image here, the first ever video game strategy guide was for Space Invaders. It was published by Herald in 1979 called How to Attack Invaders. It was later translated in a cut-down form into sort of barely comprehensible and comical English and sold as a 61-page pamphlet in 1980 by Taito itself. And according to the Winner's Book of Video Games by Craig Kube, this book was barely advertised but sold like hotcakes. And in addition to high score strategy, the Japanese version of the book, which you see here, actually delves into Invader clones, rumors, and even kind of a little bit into how the machine itself operates. And the English one includes a corporate history of Taito and their ideas on why Space Invaders became so successful.
And a special shout out to Video Game History Foundation librarian Phil Salvador for helping us out with digging into that weird English book.
It was fun. All right. Western Boom.
Yeah. So Space Invaders, it had its moment in the sun in Japan, but it also had a big impact in the West as well. Taito initially had plans to distribute it in the U.S. themselves, but after it exploded in Japan, they realized that if that happens again in the West, there's no way in heck that their dinky little U.S. operation could manage that. So they made contact with Midway, Bally Midway, at the November Amusement and Music Operators Association show, and they debuted their version of Space Invaders there in November. That's the Midway version. It's basically the exact same game. It also had a lot of critical interest, but there wasn't a lot of orders at first. But by February of 1979, that game had exploded in the U.S. as well. It was a major hit for Midway, which they really needed to compete with Atari, which was the big gorilla in the room in the Western arcade space at the time. You didn't have the same Invader House kind of thing going on in the West. You kind of saw it in some areas, like in Hawaii, you had the Invader Wars. And these were sort of the same basic concept, but on the mainland, like you had places that had a lot of Space Invaders machines, but this is like the same basic idea where Space Invaders just dominates the whole building. Yes, this was in May, Midway introduced their own tabletop version, the cocktail cabinet. I think it's not the same design as the tabletop one in Japan, but it's the same concept. And overall, Midway sold about 65,000 of these Space Invaders units in the West, which were massive figures. There's only a few arcade games in U.S. History that have outsold Space Invaders. It's like Pac-Man and Asteroids and probably, I don't know, Street Fighter. I'd have to double check that one. But yeah, Hawaii was a real hot spot, and that's sort of where you saw some of the early score chasers come into this. Like Howard Yee here, he got interviewed several times by Hawaiian newspapers about Space Invaders and why he's so good at it.
And then just briefly, we'll touch on Space Invaders Part 2 since it came so hot on the heels of the original. It was announced in a press conference July 30th, 1979, published in September 1979 in Japan, and the Western release through Midway came not long after, around November. At its core, it's the same, but it adds a lot of new interesting features. It adds a new invader type that splits when it's shot into multiple other aliens that kind of grow and shrink with each step. And a second type of mystery ship or UFO can go across the top, which actually blinks. And while it's invisible, it can't be hit. So your shot will pass right through it, and it's always worth 500 points. And that the UFO can actually drop off top row invaders to sort of refill them in, starting in wave 3 to kind of fill in any gaps. It features, you can kind of see some of them here with the SOS part over there on the left. It kind of has these goofy cutscenes in between some waves with the invaders calling for backup. And over there on the right, the trail visual bug that we mentioned from the original game kind of got elaborated on here. A much more intentional effect with this sort of what a lot of people call the rainbow as it descends. And this one was or Space Invaders Part 2 or Space Invaders Deluxe was reasonably successful, but by the time it came out, it was really overshadowed by Namco's Galaxian, which came out November 1979 in Japan, and Midway published it here January 1980, selling 50,000 units here. Mm-hmm.
But, there was still a place for Space Invaders. People were still interested in it. So we had a couple of Western spin-offs out of Bally Midway. On the right is Gorf. This was a 5-stage shooter developed by Jamie Fenton. Bally Midway published it. And because they still had the rights to Space Invaders, the first stage was Astro Battles. It's just Space Invaders with a couple of little twists on it. And on the left here, we have Space Invaders Pinball. Which was a rare wide-body release by Bally. The production stopped earlier than they anticipated because the back glass has this very H.R. Geiger alien motif to it, and as it turns out, that was not very well appreciated by the production company behind Alien. But before that got stopped, they sold 11,000 units, it's not that bad of a success there. about the only thing it has in common with Space Invaders. The game is the name and the sound effects. Everything else is sort of on its own. And we talked a little bit about how this game became like this high-scoring phenomenon and sort of kicked that whole subculture off. And you've done a lot of research into
I
this.
have. I got surprisingly deep into this, actually. So as Kevin alluded to earlier, the point values of those UFOs are absolutely not random. They can be anywhere from 50 to 300 points, and we actually have, real quick here, a chart here. It's all mapped to the number of shots you take. This is from, I believe, the English language Taito book, if I'm not mistaken.
Yep.
That actually maps which shots are worth what amount of points. So at a high level, which is where the count your shots in the panel title comes from, it really takes some effort to learn how to do this, but if you want a high score, this is what you have to do. The basic pattern is you have to fire 22 shots off at the beginning before that first UFO appears, hit it on the 23rd, you'll get 300. And every time after that, and I have a horrible typo in there, sorry about that, 14 shots before the next UFO appears and hit it on the 15th. And then you just kind of rinse and repeat as you go on there. And
we both managed to miss that. Wow.
Yes, somehow. Anyway, so you have some strategies that came out of Japan at the time. The first one being the Nagoya shot or the Nagoya uchi. This is your kanji lesson for the day, everyone. That's how you write Nagoya uchi. It's sort of a classic five. It's possible, and we'll show a video of it in a moment here, due to kind of a funky hitbox and what Nishikado calls sort of an unintended yet undiscovered bug, where when invaders hit the very bottom of the screen, they actually can't damage you and they can't take out your cannon. So you can kind of just sweep along and take them out. And I feel like this is probably best served by an example here.
Yeah, just skip over to it.
Yeah, I'm gonna basically at a high level.
Oh, that's loud.
Hold on, I will fix that. There we go. That's better. Anyway, so you can kind of see at the end here, you're taking them out to where you have a gap in the middle here, and this gap is pretty much key to any of the other scoring strategies we'll look at. And as they're going across the side of the screen, you can kind of see you're just able to sweep through and hit them on damage. You have to be a little bit quick about it, and then eventually when you get to the end, you'll have your last row, and you just, I messed up a little bit there, but I managed to recover.
And there you go.
And that's sort of how that goes. You also have short variations on this, obviously based on the places that they were developed. Nagoya Uchi came from Nagoya, Kyoto Uchi came from Kyoto. This one is where you open up a hole in the middle, and then you just kind of let the invaders go to the bottom. But because only one column has been removed, the timing on this is super strict. My preferred method is sort of a hybrid between all of these things, which is a very specific pattern set, which we'll just briefly take a look at. First screen, you can kind of do whatever. They're the slowest on this screen no matter what anyway. Second to third screens, you'll want to remove the third and fourth columns from the left, 4 through 6. You take out the fifth from the right, 7th through 9th, the second from the left, and then it just recycles back from 2 to 9. You never actually see the speed or the pattern from screen 1 again. And the reason that this works the way it is, just sort of at a high level, is because, again, the invaders are starting down lower and lower, and they're moving faster and faster, so one pattern just does not work for every single screen, not really. You kind of, if you want an easier time of it, you kind of just have to adjust. And I'll just go real quick over some of these. See, this is the idea of kind of opening up these two columns here. 2 and 3 are where you're going to get most of your points, just because it's kind of easy going with this pattern for the most part.
Yeah.
And then when you get down to the bottom here, you can kind of see it's just the same sort of deal. It's just you have to be able to do it from multiple directions pretty much. And same with here, you're just opening yourself up this kind of one column, so you have a little bit less freedom, but it will result in them hitting the bottom and you just kind of being able to do this as long as you know what direction to go in. And then for the final set for 7 through 9, again, you're just kind of opening one up on the left here where you can use to hit those UFOs. There we go. And then ultimately, same sort of deal. The thing you will have to practice the most is just tapping over ever so slightly to get those invaders on the last row because they move really, really fast.
Yeah, you kind of have to lead your shot on the very last one.
You absolutely
or
do.
Else it'll just whiz right by you.
You can kind of see in a lot of them I'm actually moving like back over away from them as they're coming, and that's what I found works best for me. So that's scoring at a high level.
So take note of that because it won't work on the next few versions that you see. So Space Invaders was such a big hit that everyone wanted to make a home version of it. The first to do so was Bally, because they had their own home console in 1978, 1979 called the Professional Arcade. As anyone who knows me knows, this is a particular thing I love.
It's only for professionals.
Yeah, it's only for professionals. If you're an amateur arcader, you go somewhere else. Go play your Atari. But they had a Space Invaders game that came out in 1979, December, end of the year. And that is this. I guess you can start the video going if you want. As you can see, it's not super accurate, but they did the best they could. It's not like they had access to the code of these Japanese games, so they were just sort of doing what they could to match it. This was not really pulled off of shelves, but they had to relabel it as Astro Battles starting in February 1980 because Atari announced at that time that they had the exclusive home rights to Space Invaders. There's only 32 invaders on the screen. None of the scoring things really work. UFOs emerge randomly, like completely randomly. So you could have none of them show up on a screen, or you could have like 5 of them show up on a screen. And the point values are also completely random. And by round 7, the invaders start so low to the ground, it's literally impossible to actually beat it. So that's that version. The next one I want to talk about is in Japan, and that is TV Vader, which was later republished on the Cassette Vision as Battle Vader, but it's the exact same game in both cases. So this was apparently licensed by Taito, according to NEC engineer Tetsushi Oguchi, who I asked about this. NEC designed the chips that this game used, and Epoch published it. Since there's severe hardware limitations, as you can see, only the bottom row of invaders on any given row are actually shown on screen. The other ones are there, you just can't see them. And it takes some aspects from Invaders Part 2. Oh yeah, they also dance whenever you die. So like you have blinking UFOs. Shot counting does work, but it's not the same shot counting method as the arcade version. It's actually in the manual what the point values are. So yeah, this did fairly well for Epic. I believe they sold. Well, shoot, I forgot to write it down. They sold, I want to say it was like 500,000 units. That sounds right. Yeah, it did pretty well for them. And when they published the Cassette Vision home console, that you had like distinct cartridges, and it's a super weird design. So like all of these cartridges have like the processors and everything in them. They just put TV Vader on a cartridge and sold it as Battle Vader. So that was in 1982. But the next one is sort of the big one behind the arcade version. That is the Atari 2600 VCS home version. This came out in March 1980 in the U.S. Sometime in 1980 in Japan, Epoch published it because they have the license for the VCS there. This was developed by Rick Moore. That's the fellow on the right there. This was his first project coming to Atari. He was originally a game developer at Fairchild for the Channel F home console. According to a keynote address he did at the Classic Gaming Expo in 2004, he decided to make this out independently of any licensing agreement that Atari may or may not have had, solely because he really liked Space Invaders and he wanted to make a home version of this as best as he could with the hardware limitations he had to work with. All of this is based off of his observations of the arcade game. So again, there's no shot counting, there's no like death floor or anything like that. He apparently had some issues getting it running initially. There was a lot of flicker in his first versions, like just because there were so many objects on the screen, the Atari couldn't keep up with all of them at once. And no one really seemed particularly interested in this game at the company, so he just eventually gave up work on it after about 4 or 5 months, and started working on a different game called Maze Craze. But he came back to it because Atari's parent company, Warner, the CEO, Manny Gerard, pushed Atari's CEO, Ray Kassar, to pursue the license because some of the folks had been telling him, it's like, hey, this game's really popular among Atari employees and the broader public. We need to nail this license down and get a home version together. And this had never been done before. This is the first licensed home port of a game that a company did not, do themselves, basically. Because Moore had already started working on this, they just had him go back and, finish it. And with the break he'd taken, he was able to fix the flickering issue. He spent a few months winnowing down the size of the game from 7 kilobytes to 4, because that was the largest cartridge size they had available at the time. Separately, Epic's Masayuki Hordier indicated in a 1998 interview with Game Odyssey that Shmuplation's translated, thankfully, that they also had requested Atari do a home version for the VCS because they could not move these consoles in Japan, and they realized that would be the game to do it. Whether or not that was a factor in Atari getting the license, I have not been able to pin down. I've reached out to a few people who worked at Atari in their exports and licensing area, and I haven't heard anything. But either way, it did reasonably well in Japan for the system that they had. But Taito did not provide him any information even after they got the license. So again, he just had to keep doing his own thing because he really liked the idea of having different variations. You see here a few of the different ones. Like you've got moving shields, you've got invisible invaders that only appear when you hit them. They've got like moving bombs. It gets pretty wild. He reasoned that as long as people liked one version of the game, then it was worth it, and it sold extremely, extremely well for them. Oh, well, before I move on to that, the soundscape of this was something he spent a lot of time trying to get right, because he felt the audio of the arcade game was the most, impactful thing about it. So it doesn't sound like the arcade game, but it does have, a very distinct soundscape. Yep. And this game was basically single-handedly responsible for turning the American home video game market from this, tiny little niche to an absolute juggernaut, like $1 billion industry. This sold roughly, 1 million units in its first year, something like that. Roughly 1 million VCS units also sold between 1977 and 79. And Space Invaders sold 1 million more in 1980 alone. According to some internal documentation, in 1981, this game sold 3.1 million, or 3 million copies, and Atari sold 3.1 million VCSs. So that is an incredible attach rate. This game was huge. And sales just basically remained strong for this game until the VCS stopped being sold in 1990. And eventually, Atari had cartridge shortages, even with all these units of this game that they were making. And that sort of led up to the whole market crash. I don't want to get into it too much because we don't have much time left. There is a crappy home port for the Atari computer system that Rob Fulop did. It's not really based on Space Invaders that closely because he didn't really think that hard about people wanting a home port that was like Space Invaders. And that led him to reconsider his approach when he had to do Missile Command for the VCS, which is a lot closer. So here's a couple notable unlicensed clones. Super Invasion is particularly notable. That's on the Apple II, and it uses the paddle controls to move. But outside of that, that is basically one-to-one Space Invaders. It has all the same tactics work on it. It was written by an M. Hata and published through Creative Computing Software in the West. Sold about 20,000 units by June 1982, and was just a huge hit for them. We also have Alien Invasion for the Channel F, which was their final game, and Space Destroyers, which was the final game for the MP1000. Alien Invasion is kind of like their take on the Atari Space Invaders. Space Destroyers is like a pretty good version of the arcade game. And that'll take us to the Japanese ports.
Yeah, we'll blaze through a few of these real quick. The Famicom one is it looks and sort of reasonably feels like Space Invaders, but weirdly screens 1 through 8 are original Space Invaders, and 9 through 16 are Space Invaders Part 2. So don't know why. And then after that, it's a mix of both. Counting and everything works, but the timing just seems way more strict on this one. You have to be really fast if you're doing those tactics down on the last row. And the elephant in the room is that weird UI. They decided to move the scoring and everything over to the right-hand side for some strange reason. So not great.
So we have the SG-1000 version real quick here. This was developed internally at Sega, and it's a remarkably accurate version of the game. All of the tricks and treats of the arcade version work right here. It also feels very accurate to the original arcade game. So
Yep.
if you have an SG-1000 for some reason, or if you're like me and just emulated it, it's pretty good.
And going faster through some of these, we had one on PC Engine. Feels better, but still has sort of the same problem with the UI being over there on the right.
So here we have the Game Boy game, which is super weird. It does not have the appropriate number of columns of the invaders, although shot counting does work. There's some resolution differences. The most notable thing here is that the US version comes with the Super Famicom Space Invaders on the cartridge. If you plug it into a Super Game Boy, you can load up that version.
And this is the Super Famicom version, Space Invaders, the original game. Maybe the first, like, nice-looking, really accurate conversion, I feel like. And weirdly, it had the Moonscape thing, and weirdly, it came out for the PC Engine CD as well, using, as far as I can tell, no capabilities that actually took advantage of the PC Engine CD. It was kind of just there.
So here's the Virtual Boy collection version, which is notable for this weird 3D version. Shout out to Jeremy Parrish for providing us this footage. It has both Space Invaders 1 and 2, and this 3D perspective is an optional way to play it. You were playing it last night on a flash card, and it
takes some getting used to because of the perspective shift.
Yeah, it's very strange.
And just real fast, we had a couple other ports on CD-based systems, which are really just like the Super Famicom version, but with these kind of bells and whistles where you can play them in different modes. Space Invaders 2000 had a weird arrange mode, and maybe most importantly, it had demos of Densha de Gotu and G. Darius. And then we had actually a simple 1500 game, which had the original version as well as this kind of weird almost take on the Virtual Boy 3D thing that we had here.
So Space Invaders today, still very recognizable. It's a big part of Taito's marketing when they're talking about retro games, which is basically all Taito does nowadays. They make cameos in other games, like they're in Bubble Bobble as an enemy. Arkanoid, they show up there. It's commonly referenced even overseas. Futurama had an episode where Space Invaders got a good joke. There was an episode of Taskmaster a couple of years ago, like the British show, where they had people reenact Space Invaders in person. It's pretty funny.
And we had some other things. We had an Arkanoid versus Space Invaders game, which was interesting and had a lot of like Taito Easter eggs and what have you. Really fun game. Came as a part of the Invincible collection.
I'll touch on Gigamax really quick because this is interesting. This was a special Space Invaders installation that was produced in 2018. Not originally but then they changed it to the 40th anniversary. They forgot what year it came out in originally. This is the original 10-player version that was at the Roppongi Hills observation deck in Tokyo. And then they took it on tour to multiple different cities as a 20-player version before ending up back in Tokyo in 2020. Last I heard, it's still there. I can't tell you for sure.
And lastly, there was a Game Center CX specific version of Space Invaders where Audino Kacho did all the sound effects.
300点ボーナスを狙います。
これ 23？ さあ23発撃ってなかったら無理やで。
A little bit hard to hear, but he's going like pew, 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 pew in the background for all the shots.
Yeah, it's really funny. So yeah, Space Invaders really, it's where the shooting genre really came out of. Like, you wouldn't have something like Galaxian or Xevious or later games like Scramble or Darius without Space Invaders, like putting those rules in place, really. And yeah, I think that's basically all we got, time-wise and content-wise. So
thank you, everybody.